Great to be here. Fortunately, I did bring my scarf with me for this cold temperature. This study, working along with Ravi Ramani, is looking a little bit differently from some of the other presentations today, doing a comparison of France and the US and the perception of students in terms of internship value. And this is a work in progress, so if you've got any suggestions or comments or feedback, that would be tremendous help. Okay. The agenda is, I want to share with you my motivation, just a little bit on drivers, that's been kind of talked about a bit already here, some key internship characteristics, and national context, to kind of talk about those two pieces together. A big question, I'm still trying to disentangle this, does national context matter in terms of student perceptions? A little bit about data and methods, but not too much, some results, and then some questions to consider. I wanted to start off by saying, you know, at my table, one of the people at my table said, what got you into this area, how long you've been in this? And I said, well, it was just a couple of years ago, because I hadn't thought too much about internships. But I actually had a student say, Professor McHugh, you really need to read this book by Ross Perlin, Internship Nation. It describes my life. And so I did read the book, and it was really kind of eye-opening to see the perspectives on internships and potential exploitation, shortcomings, and so forth. So that raised my interest. The next motivation for this is that I had an opportunity to teach in France. I had my scarf there as well. And that was a great experience, but what also happened over there is that I came across protests, that students were protesting. This was the precarious generation. They'd wear white masks, that they were kind of disenfranchised from the labor market. And one of the big areas of protest, and the sign reads, trainee abused, disguised job. So the similar complaints I was hearing from my US students, I was hearing it from the French students. So I said, I've got to explore this issue in a little bit more detail. Okay. So one issue I kind of call the intern-focused kind of perspective is internships are supposed to be about development and career planning and a stepping stone and networking, right? So one area is what factors contribute to enhancing the developmental value of an internship. Another intern-focused part of this is, these students want jobs, right? And so this is a picture of a job fair, hundreds and thousands of students getting together trying to get jobs. So what factors explain intent to pursue employment with the intern host? So those are sort of two intern-focused kind of perspectives on this motivation. But also there's an intern-host perspective here, or the employer perspective as well, right? They want a talented workforce, but they also want to build an employment brand. It's not just getting that intern to want to work for them, right? It's what factors explain the intent to pursue employment with that intern host? Building a brand, getting employees. And I like this quote from an Int'l campus relations manager. Ultimately, you want interns to have such a great experience they leave and tell friends and family you're a great place to work. It's not just to hire that intern, but it's to create that employment brand. So what are the drivers? I just want to talk about these briefly. From the intern host perspective, there's been a lot of research on non-standard work and precarious work, and that's become normalized. Internships have become sort of an assessment center where employers can engage in recruiting and selection. Low-cost source of tech skills and ideas. Work experience is highly valued, and that's kind of come out, I think, in some of the earlier presentations today. And another thing that I think is kind of important is that this whole internship area is what I kind of refer to as an institutional soft space. The regulation is kind of murky. The enforcement of the regulation is extremely murky. And it's sort of outside the scope of collective bargaining as a point of leverage for interns. So it's institutionally kind of a soft area. Students demand, I mean, it's out there, right? It's a mechanism to signal to potential employers, a means to audition, a developmental opportunity. And for higher education institutions, I think we're all experiencing pressure to incorporate this into curriculum, rise in pedagogies and classroom learning that integrates work experiences, marketing to students. You know, if you come to our school, there's internships waiting for you. We've got connections. But also there's a financial incentive to give credit for work experience. And this is somewhat of a controversial issue, I think, if you're having students pay to work and the university doesn't have to hire faculty, you know, so on and so forth. Okay. So internship characteristics. One that I focused on is supervisor behavior, and one of them is supervisor support, the degree to which a supervisor values an employee contributions and cares about employee well-being. And there's been quite a bit of research that's linked this to intern satisfaction, interns' commitment to the organization, their attraction to the organization, job pursuit, and developmental value. Another part of supervisor behavior is supervisor mentoring. So this is the degree which a supervisor provides direction and feedback regarding career plans and personal development. And there's been research here showing that these outcomes have been linked to that internship characteristic, attraction, pursuit, and developmental value. Another characteristic is work design. So to what extent task goal clarity becomes important. So understanding the work products that are expected and the standards by which those products will be evaluated. And so there's been research linking that to intern satisfaction and job pursuit intentions. And the final characteristic that I've looked at in the studies is the amount of autonomy within the internship. So here, you know, there's no hyphen in micromanager as the person's leaning over the boss. Okay. Every week I send this to my department chair. Okay. So you break free of that autonomy, the discretion individuals have to complete their assigned tasks. And there's been research that's linked that to intern satisfaction, acceptance of job offers, and improvements in vocational self-concept. So based on prior research, we would expect these kinds of relationship, that these task characteristics would predict perceived developmental value and the intern's intent to pursue employment with the intern host. So I think that's sort of out there. But the question that I sort of pose in this more recent kind of exploratory study is, do these relationships hold in other institutional and cultural contexts? And so we've got the French flag and US flag here. So what role does national context play? I mean, does national context impact developmental value perceptions? Does it impact the pursuit of employment intentions? Does it impact characteristics? So what I want to talk about is, before looking at results, is looking at some of these different regulatory differences, contextual differences, cultural kind of differences. Okay. So in France, you've got a highly regulated economy with strong employment protections. In the US, you've got a liberal market economy with passive employment protections. In France, the regulatory framework for internships has grown and expanded over time. For example, compensation is required if you're on an internship for 2 months, no matter if it's private sector, nonprofit, or public. And you can only work in an internship for 6 months. It's limited, because the concern there is that employers are using interns to substitute for regular employees. There's record-keeping requirements that the employer has to keep regarding the name of the student, when they've arrived, what school they're coming from. And labor inspectors need to have access to that information. It requires a tripartite contract between the intern host, the intern, and the educational institution. And open market internships are prohibited. You just can't sort of go out and find yourself an internship. Need to kind of go through this tripartite process to have a legitimate internship. In the US, the regulatory framework has weakened over time. Okay. Paid intern is considered an employee under federal law. An unpaid intern is permitted in the public and nonprofit sector. An unpaid internship is legal in the private sector if the intern is the primary beneficiary of the internship, and we could probably have a whole half-day session on trying to figure that change in the interpretation of the from the Department of Labor. And open market internships are permitted. Okay. So that's sort of regulatory contextual difference. There's a higher education context difference as well. In France, there's aggressive integration of internships into degree programs, widespread growing mandatory requirement in France. This is partly a result, and maybe primarily a result of something called the Bologna process, which arises out of the European Union, where those countries are all trying to find some commonality in terms of higher education so that students can kind of degree programs are transferable across universities within the European Union. In the U.S., I would refer to it some movement to integrate internships into degree programs, but maybe after today I will change that to larger movement than this. But compared to France, I would say it's some movement. There's a financial incentive, as I mentioned earlier, to provide economic credit to internship participants. Subsidizing intern hosts by providing funding to students in unpaid internships, and I think kind of talked about that a little bit. I think it's kind of interesting to really kind of push the thinking on that. Should we be subsidizing employers paying for unpaid work? So I think it's kind of interesting to think more about that, but not particularly in this study. And mandatory internships are less common. In France, higher ed is more centralized and standardized, whereas in the U.S., I would say higher ed is more decentralized and variable. Just today, hearing people talking about technical colleges, you've got community colleges, you've got tribal college. It's highly variable. In France, as I mentioned earlier, you've got the tripartite contract requirements. In the U.S., students can enter into an internship with an intern host with an educational institution having some involvement or little involvement or no involvement. So it's, I think Matt in one of his documents somewhere, I think, said something about the interns of the Wild West of, in the U.S., right? Elite schools have major influence on employment and career opportunities in France. One thing I learned when I was in France, the school you went to mattered, and it mattered a lot in terms of your future employment opportunities, where in the U.S. elite schools have moderate influence on career and employment opportunities. Definitely there's an influence, but not to the degree that I experienced in the French kind of context. There's also cultural differences that I think impact student perceptions in the internship experience. So in France, using Hofstede's kind of dimensions of culture, France, high power distance, there's greater acceptance that power is distributed unequally within organizations and across the broader society as well. So what does that mean in terms of internships? Well, maybe interns might be more hesitant to pose questions and seek assistance and feedback because of this high power distance relationship. A supervisor might be less participative and more autocratic, given that cultural emphasis. And supervisors may view support and mentoring outside of their role. Okay. Whereas in the U.S., we're typically characterized as low power distance, preference for power distributed in a more egalitarian fashion. Intern likely to pose questions and seek assistance and feedback. Supervisor might be more participative and less autocratic, given that kind of cultural emphasis. And supervisor may view support and mentoring as consistent with their supervisory role. So power distance may impact kind of the internship's perceptions and the actual experience that interns have. Another dimension of Hofstede's cultural values is high uncertainty avoidance. And so in France, there's a bit more uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguous situations, and a preference for formality to create stability. So this has implications. You might expect maybe less autonomy for interns in that context, and task goal clarity may be more important for interns because of this desire to avoid uncertainty. In the U.S., you've got low uncertainty avoidance, greater toleration for uncertain and ambiguous situations, more comfortable with informality. So you might have interns having more autonomy, and task goal clarity may be less important for interns given that culture. So what does national context play in our model? Remember before we said these characteristics have relationships to developmental value and the pursuing employment with the intern host. So we've got these national context characteristics, but our question still is, what would the relationship be? What would the impact be now that we've put a little bit of meaning behind national context in terms of these characteristics? So our data and methods, our participants were French and American students enrolled in a joint program, invited to participate on an online survey, and then encouraged through a snowball sampling procedure to encourage other students that they are aware of at other institutions to kind of participate. So what we ended up with was 106 French students enrolled in 9 schools. In the U.S., we had 124 students enrolled in 16 schools. 20 of the respondents said they'd never had an internship, so we excluded them from our analysis. And so we ended up with about 210 respondents. The survey was translated from English to French, and then we did some other statistical analysis to make sure there wasn't measurement and variance in terms of how would a French person interpret this construct, how would a U.S. person in English be interpreting the construct, and we found no measurement and variance, so that was good. And then we also had about 116 of our 210 respondents had both unpaid and paid internship experiences. And so what we did is we randomly split those 116 into the paid condition and unpaid condition because we didn't want to lose statistical power, and we wanted to avoid some nesting problems. So a little bit more data and methods. We had some control variables. So we identified, from the student's perspective, were they paid or unpaid? So we controlled for compensation. We controlled for their academic status. So were they in the first year of their program, second, third, or fourth year of their program? In their degree program, was it a business-related program or a non-business related? So can't really dig into the weeds that I think are important. We saw earlier in terms of thinking about the different majors that students can be involved in, so we're not able to disaggregate it in that kind of way. Our predictor variables were country, France, U.S. We measured autonomy. For example, this internship I had a lot of flexibility in how I completed my work. Task goal clarity, I was given clear objectives about what I needed to accomplish. Supervisor support. My supervisor's internship really cared about my well-being, and then mentoring. To what extent did your supervisor suggest strategies for achieving career goals? That gives you a flavor of some of the questions. And then our outcome variables or dependent variables for developmental value. I learned skills or knowledge important for my career development, and then job pursuit intent. I would make this organization one of my first choices as an employer. So again, here we're looking at internship characteristics and developmental value to see if this kind of holds up. And what we found is controlling for compensation, degree program, academic status, that there was no statistically significant relationship with autonomy and task clarity, but supervisor support and mentoring were important with all our population put in there, all our sample of French and U.S. students. We did the same thing with intent to pursue, and we found the same, that supervisor support and mentoring were positive and significant. Our other 2 task characteristics were not significant, controlling for those 3 factors. Then we looked at national context to see if that was a factor, and yes, U.S. respondents reported higher developmental value in their internship. Okay, controlling for comp, degree program, academic status. Again, now we looked at pursuit, to pursue employment. National context mattered again, that U.S. respondents reported higher job pursuit intention with their intern host. So there is some kind of national context thing going on here. Next, we want to look at, does national context predict characteristics? And we found, yes, that U.S. respondents reported higher autonomy, greater supervisor support and mentoring, where task goal clarity, there was no statistical relationship. So our question then became, does national context have a direct effect on developmental value? So is this the relationship that country is going to predict developmental value, or is it really internship characteristics that account for country effects? That it's not really country, but it's differences in the internship characteristics. And so we asked the same question here in terms of intention to pursue employment. What we found was that when we control for this, that country does not have a direct effect, that it's a direct relationship between those internship characteristics, and more importantly, that it's actually supervisor support and mentoring that seem to be the key predictor of developmental value, perceptions of developmental value, and their intent to pursue employment. Okay. So we still, we see this national context. One shortcoming of our paper is we can't really disentangle this. To what extent is it the level of regulation or differences in regulation? Or to what extent is it the intensity of higher education's involvement? Or is it just kind of cultural kind of factors? A major weakness that we have, and still trying to figure this out, is how do you disentangle these? How can we figure out what impact these are having? So moving forward, questions to consider. U.S. students perceive more developmental value in their internship experience and greater desire to pursue employment with their intern host. So do regulations and school requirements constrain French employers in creating a meaningful internship experience? Part of it is, do we need enhanced regulation? Do we need more school involvement? Do mandatory internships increase the likelihood for mismatch between interns and intern hosts? We're talking about creating programs that require students to have internships. What are the implications of that? Do mandatory internships become viewed more as degree requirement than a developmental opportunity, both from the intern themselves and from intern hosts? And does school status limit the value that interns and intern hosts place on internship experiences? So one question just kind of fading from this is, should educational institutions mandate internships? What role does culture play in explaining this variation? U.S. respondents reported higher autonomy, support, and mentoring. This is consistent with cultural differences around power distance and uncertainty avoidance. So future research maybe needs to disentangle this cultural institutional factors if we want to do some kind of cross-national research and learn what really is impacting students' experiences with internships. And then finally, I think what really jumps out of this is the role of supervisors. So differences in country are no longer significant in the presence of supervisor support and mentoring. Supervisors play a critical role from the perspective of interns in their internship outcomes. Should students in higher education institutions screen intern hosts in terms of their level of supervisory commitment to intern support and mentoring? And what kinds of training and resources can intern hosts provide to supervisors in order to enhance their ability to provide interns with the support and mentoring that they need? Okay. This is really a growing area of research and policy interest. The International Labor Organization just come out with 2 new studies looking at the comparative regulation of internships across countries, and then looking at this bridge to stable employment, which I think, our previous presentation is kind of looking at that to a degree. So this is a really hot area, and kind of, earlier question today is, why aren't researchers looking at this? I think they are, and more researchers are going to be looking at this topic in the future. And just to leave you with this, you've been accused of cruel and abusive behavior. Is it true you made your staff sit through a PowerPoint presentation? Guilty as charged. So thank you.
What were the qualifications that made a job classified as an internship? not a job, but a posting?
Well, in our context, the employer had to actively check a box that this is an internship. So that's how we know. They had to, because they've made a mistake maybe, but there were 36,000 of them. So I think that.
Yes.
I think this is for everybody. So when you're speaking internships and you're looking at the research, are you pulling out the clinical program, student teaching, and all the things that are within a curricular required for graduation kind of space, that kind of experiential learning, and only going with a job/internship when you're doing your research?
In my study thus far, it's sort of been self-reported, so I'm not defining what an internship is for the respondents. That's kind of an interesting and I think difficult challenge in this whole space is, what exactly is an internship and how do we define it? One thought that I sort of have is if the student is defining, if the student's defining as an internship and probably putting it on their resume as an internship, maybe it is. But that's a good point, right? There's a lot of variation in what these things can look like.
Okay, in the back there, back table.
Thank you both for your presentation. My question's for Dr. McHugh. Is in regard to the study that you did, I'm really curious to find out with both the U.S. and the France interns, if they were questioned about any prep work they had done prior to going into the internship, or if that's something you plan on including. Because what I'm finding with my work with interns is every year I'm including more and more preparatory work with them to prepare them to go, like how to deal with, I work with students going to France or French-speaking countries, how to prepare for that experience, what does it mean culturally, and those, I'm finding the more and more work I'm doing with that over the years, the better the outcome of the experience because they're prepped for that. So I'm wondering if that's something you plan on including in the study or you were able to view or...
It wasn't included in this study,
Yeah.
but the results of my study are suggesting that that's such an important element, right, to prepare students for internships. And it kind of, the presentations earlier today kind of talking about, the extent the programs and the resources that are needed and sustainability is, I think, higher education institutions have to make bigger commitments to devoting resources to preparing students for this experience rather than just saying you need to commit an internship if you want this degree or to get credit for this. How do you prepare? How do you get them to learn? How do you engage a supervisor? What's your role in getting support and mentoring? How do you, if you're going through the application process as a student to go with multiple internship possibilities, do you investigate that or try to get a sense of what kind of supervisory support and mentoring is available? So,
Yeah.
It wasn't included, but I think
Right.
it's a valuable outcome.
Yeah, thank you.
So we'll take about 5 more minutes for questions. We'll kind of go over a little bit, ma'am.
Mr. Nolly, I have a quick question for you. I'm Kendra Nash from Tennessee State University. When you created the statistician's resumes, what did you do to show the correlation between the black and the white students? What experiences, reports, things you actually put on the resume to show that they were discriminated against?
First of all, I'm from Tennessee too. So the other thing, so we used a resume randomizer.
Okay.
So we picked a bank of characteristics, different types of internships. Like I said before, 4 different names. I couldn't go into every detail that we did because of time. The different majors and sort of all the resumes are randomly populated with these characteristics. And so, not to go into causal inference, but that sort of circumvents a selection problem that you would have looking at, say, survey data or administrative data. So we could say that there is definitively discrimination. So does that answer your question?
Was it just the names of the...
Yeah, just the name signaled race.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so we used to think, the book Freakonomics, for example, has lists of the whitest and blackest names, and sort of we use that and the Social Security name database to pick names that were racially distinct.
Okay. Thank you.
That's sort of interesting. Sam?
This is for Dr. McHugh. when you were talking about future research related to this internship being mandatory at a school, does it become a degree requirement, or is it more of a developmental opportunity? We're talking about the preparation for the students, but are you going to be looking at how the schools support the students in terms of the reflective process during the internship that adds to their development over the course? So I know you focused on the mentors, the supervisors, but there's also that piece, that reflective piece, that should go along with it. Has there been any conversation related to that?
I haven't, but again, I think that's such a vital, important piece, right? The preparatory part of that. And I think the more serious the institutions take that piece, I think it creates a culture within the student community about that this isn't just a degree requirement, that this is something that's going to be really helpful towards my career. And I think that's why that's such a critical piece up front to do that. I think that's the implication. I haven't done sort of the research looking at that, but it might be kind of interesting to do some kind of study trying to assess, across various institutions, how are they prepping and what's the student reaction to that.
Well, and I'm not talking about the preparation ahead of time. I'm talking about the reflection during the opportunity, like looking at best practices for helping a student to reflect while she's at the internship. So that's, during the process.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? In terms of what is that reflection like? Is that reflection of, geez, it's another assignment that I have to do? Or is it a really meaningful reflection where, boy, when I look at this now, I don't think I really want to go into accounting after all said and done, right? So I think that's a critical piece. And I think that's for any class assignment that you give students, right? That, is it a meaningful piece of work, or does this feel like just a piece of business?